All right, so this covers Kenney's text, Physiology of Sport and Exercise. And so in this particular chapter, we're going to cover the respiratory system and its regulation. And you probably already have a pretty good understanding that the respiratory and the cardiovascular system basically work together to ensure that oxygen is carried, to your cells and carbon dioxide is removed. And this requires several different processes that must occur. One of those is pulmonary ventilation, and so basically what that is moving air into and out of the lungs. So we're going to have to move volumes out. And then there's diffusion, pulmonary diffusion, and the diffusion is when the gases are moving from high concentration to low concentration. So we want to move the oxygen from the outside to the inside, and we want to move the carbon dioxide from the inside of the body to the outside. And we're going to realize that these actually occur in multiple places. And then we also want to use the circulatory system, the blood vessels, to transport those gases in the blood. And then that gas exchange, is going to occur at the tissue level, but it's also going to occur at the pulmonary level within the lungs. So the gases are moving in and out of the lungs, but the gases are moving also in and out of the blood vessels at the level of the tissues. So just want to note that diffusion, again, is always from high areas of concentration for the gas to low areas of concentration. And that's going to help drive the movement of the oxygen and drive the movement of the carbon dioxide. And then we'll talk about the regulation of the pulmonary ventilation, how that occurs using your brainstem. And then we'll add to that a layer called, another variable called the afferent feedback from those exercising limbs. Now, two key terms in the overview section of your text. One is external respiration, the other is internal respiration. External respiration is the gas exchange between the outside air and inside your body. So technically, the gases that are inside your lungs are really not inside your body yet. So they're going to move from the inside space of your lungs. Those oxygen molecules are going to move from the inside space in your lungs, and then they're going to move into your blood and get carried away by red blood cells. So that's called external respiration because the exchange is really with outside air. So that's how we refer to that term. And likewise, carbon dioxide would move from the blood, to the inside of your lungs and then be exhaled. Now, internal respiration is specifically the gas exchange that occurs between the vessels and the tissues inside your body. So the blood carries the oxygen away to some tissue in your body, and that oxygen is going to move from the vessels to that tissue. So that's called internal respiration. Of course, CO2 would move in opposite direction. All right, so let's move on to some additional respiratory system components. So one of those that we'll first talk about is pulmonary ventilation. So pulmonary ventilation is that act of breathing and moving that air in and out of the lungs. And so what you see here is a picture of the respiratory system. And so at rest, the air is typically drawn into the lungs through the nose and through the mouth. And so generally the mouth is used when the need or the demand increases. So nasal breathing is actually more advantageous because the air that's coming into the nose gets warmed. You have some nasal conchae that are inside your nasal cavity, and they actually slow the air movement down. So the air has to kind of swirl around in your nose actually before it, goes to the back and then heads towards your trachea. And it's also humidified because you have mucus in there. And so that mucus is moisture inside your nose, and it's going to humidify and add moisture to the air. Okay. So those nasal conchae, you can't see them very well in this picture, but if you wanted to look up a picture of the nasal conchae in the nasal cavity, you would see that they have what are called structures called turbinates, and they actually cause the air to have a turbulent flow, and that turbulent flow is what causes the air to hang around in your nose longer. And the benefit there is, the things I've already demonstrated, but it's also in filtering out any particles. So, you have nasal hairs, you have the mucus to trap things. And so, that's allows the air to hang around a little bit longer. Then from the nose or the mouth, the air is going to travel down the pharynx. Then it's going to go to the larynx where the voice box is and down through the trachea, and then it'll get to those bronchial trees. and they'll become smaller and smaller and smaller. So this is called the transport zone or the conducting zone. And so if you were taking in air, it would go into the nasal cavity, down the pharynx, past the larynx, down to the trachea, and then it would start to, go down either side into both of the lungs, into the primary bronchi, and then this would break off further into secondary bronchi. Then there's tertiary, and then they keep going, and getting smaller and smaller. So these structures don't actually allow for gas exchange between the blood and the lungs. They're just transport tubes, if you will. So that exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide is actually going to occur when it gets down to the very, very end of the conducting segments, and then they terminate into these structures here called alveoli. So each one is an alveolus, and they look like little grapes. Okay, so this is where the gas exchange actually occurs, and you can kind of tell that because of these capillaries that are wrapped around all these alveoli. And so this is actually known as the respiratory zone because gas exchange is occurring in this region, and this is considered the conducting or the transport zone. What else to tell you? The lungs are not actually directly attached to the ribs. They are suspended in what are called pleural sacs, and each lung has its own pleural sac. They have a parietal pleura. That parietal pleura actually lines the thoracic wall, the cavity, the thoracic cavity, and the pulmonary pleura. Those are that's the layer of tissue that's actually surrounding the lungs itself. And in between that, there's a space, and it's called the pleural cavity, and in that space is a little lubricating fluid. This development here of this fluid between the lungs and the cavity helps ensure that there's no rubbing away, no friction that would potentially damage the lung tissue. The other thing that helps is this, it creates sort of a suction with the thoracic cage that help kind of keep the lungs inflated and kind of adhering essentially to the rib cage. As the rib cage kind of expands and contracts, the lung tissue is going to follow it, so it's going to go with it. Diaphragm, you can't see that on this image, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the diaphragm and how that helps enlarge the thoracic cage, and that's going to help sort of pump the air in and out of the lungs during expiration and inspiration. All right, so one other thing I want to point out before I move on is as these oxygen molecules move in, they're going to be at a high concentration here, and they're going to diffuse from high to low concentration, to these capillaries. And reverse, and just in reverse, carbon dioxide, keep in mind, is going to diffuse from high concentration from these capillaries that are deoxygenated, right? And they're going to move from high concentration to low concentration just by diffusion, and then they're going to be exhaled out. So these vessels here are going to be involved in transporting those gases throughout the body, and then that capillary diffusion is going to occur elsewhere in the tissues. All right, so this one I've really already covered. Ventilation is moving the air out of the lungs. We talked about the bronchi being the transport zone and the exchange zone being the area where the alveoli are. And this is just to illustrate the pathway of oxygen molecules, right? It's going to come through your nose or your mouth, going to go swirl around by the nasal conchae, and that's going to go down through the pharynx, and down through the larynx, and then on down the trachea, and it's going to head into the bronchial tree through the different levels, smaller and smaller, and narrower the pathways get until they dead end into these alveoli, all of these little clusters. All right, so I've actually covered this too. Wow, I'm sorry I didn't move through these slides. So the lungs are suspended by pleural sacs. The pleural sacs are actually attached to the thoracic cavity, thoracic wall. We have visceral pleura. Visceral pleura are actually attached to the organ, so viscera refers to guts essentially, and so the pleura are actually attached to the lung. And then of course there's a space in between. The lungs are adhering, they're sort of stuck to, if you've ever had two cups that are stuck together and you can't get them apart. Well, basically that is what helps inflate and deflate your lungs, is that fluid, that serous fluid is actually in between the pleura lining here that's on the lungs and the parietal lining that's attached to the thoracic cavity. So there's just enough of a fluid there to create some suction, and that allows the lungs to inflate and deflate as the rib cage changes its size. All right, so I've covered the lungs, some pleurosacs. A diaphragm would be right here, and the diaphragm is going to contract, and it's going to help enlarge and reduce the size of the thoracic cavity. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Rib cage does the same thing. So it's going to, if you put your two hands at the top of your chest and you inhale, you're going to notice that your thoracic cavity moves upward and outward. Okay, so that's enlarging the thoracic cavity. And so these are all playing a key role in helping move that air, determine the airflow in and out of the lungs, and in to the lungs is inspiration and out of the lungs is expiration. All right, let's look at what happens during inspiration. So as far as inspiration goes, let's move on to this next slide so we can look at some of these pictures here. So inspiration is an active process. And so when we say that, we are talking about muscles contracting. And so what you see here on this picture here is this person is in a resting state. And you can see here that the diaphragm is really arched up right here, okay? And so this would be a person at rest. They're not taking a breath, okay? So they've basically just exhaled, all right? A couple things I want to point out is you can see the viscera pleura, that's around the lung. You can see the parietal pleura, that's the one that's attached to the cage. And then there's that serous fluid that's actually in between. You can see the sternum here. You can see how closely associated they are, these lungs are with the rib cage. Actually, your lungs actually go kind of up here. So this is not anatomically correct. Diaphragm here, you can see ribs extending downward here. All right, so this is just to show you the resting position, and with when you inspire, the ribs and the sternum, as I just shared with you, are going to move because of external intercostal muscles. So you have two layers of muscles between the ribs. They're called external intercostal muscles and internal intercostal muscles. And it's the external ones that are going to contract. And when they contract, the ribs kind of push up and out, and the sternum swings up and forward. And when they're contracting, at the same time, the diaphragm contracts. And when it contracts, it flattens and it pushes down towards your stomach, towards your abdominal cavity. Okay? And so that's what's illustrated here in B. Is you can see here that the abdominal cavity is flattening, it's pulled down. So when it's pulling down on the lung tissue. So it's pulling the lung tissue down this way. And when the rib cage is contracting because of those external intercostal muscles, it is, those muscles are getting shorter and they're actually pulling the rib cage out and forward. Okay, so when that does that, that increases the space in here. So here the space, the volume is small. Here the space, the volume increases. And so when the lungs are expanded, they have that greater volume, and therefore the air within this space has more room. It's roomier in there, right? And if you've ever heard of Boyle's gas law, Boyle's gas law says that pressure times volume is constant. Usually this assumes a constant temperature. And so when the volume is going to increase, then the pressure within the lungs is going to decrease. So as a result, that pressure in the lungs, that's that intrapulmonary pressure, is less than the air pressure outside the body. And because the respiratory tract is open to the outside, air is going to be pulled into the lungs to reduce that pressure difference. And so that's how air is moved into the lungs during inspiration. So essentially you have atmospheric pressure here at 760 millimeters of mercury. If a person's at rest and there's no difference, it's also 760 millimeters of mercury. Okay, this intrapleural pressure is this attached pressure here. That's the pressure that's in between here. And it's always 4 less than the intrapulmonary or intrapulmonic pressure. That's actually the pressure inside the lungs themselves. But if that person inhales or inspires, this muscle is going to flatten and contract and pull down, and the external intercostal muscles are going to contract and pull the thoracic cavity outward. That volume in here increases, which means pressure decreases. So now my pressure here is 758 millimeters of mercury. Well, what's pressure going to do? Pressure is going to move from high to low. So pressure is higher out here in the atmosphere, and so the air is going to move into the lungs. Okay, so that's what happens. That's what causes the air to be drawn into the lungs, is this change in pressure drives that. What drives the change in pressure? Those muscles, the external intercostal muscles, and of course the diaphragm. All right, so just remember that this is an active process. We talked about what this is, what this requires with the diaphragm and the external intercostals, and what it's doing to the rib cage and the sternum, and it's expanding that thoracic cavity, increasing the volume of the cavity and therefore the lungs also. Okay, so we know that that's an active process. Now let's talk about what happens with those pressures. I already mentioned to you Boyle's law, so we're increasing the volume. That's going to decrease that pressure inside, and that helps to pull the air inside. Okay, so air is going to passively push in. One other thing about forced breathing. So if a person is, it's pushing their, breathing more heavily, maybe during exercise, right? That inspiration is further helped by the action of other muscles. And so there are additional muscles, and there are muscles called scalenes, and then there's the sternocleidomastoid in the neck and the pectorals in the chest. Those are going to help raise the ribs even more and improve the volume, increase the volume to move more air in and out as a person is exercising, which of course is needed, right? Okay, so now I thought I was going to get to this slide. So now let's talk a little bit about expiration. Expiration is actually a passive process. Okay, so what that means is those muscles that we just talked about that contract, they're actually going to relax. When they relax, that causes a sort of a recoil. It's called an elastic recoil of the lung tissue. So as that diaphragm is relaxing, it's returning to its normal position upward. And when the external intercostal muscles relax, that's going to allow the ribs and the sternum to move back into their resting positions. And so what happens when volume decreases? That means pressure is going to increase. So now my pressure is increased in my lungs. It's 763. What is the air going to do? It's going to move from high pressure to low pressure. That means it's being pushed up and out of the lungs. So that's expiration. All right, so expiration can actually be an active process. It can be an active process during forced breathing. And in that case, the internal intercostal muscles are going to actively pull the ribs down. And so then you're going to engage other muscles like the latissimus dorsi, the quadratus lumborum muscles, and they're going to also engage the abdominal muscles to help increase that intra-abdominal pressure. And that'll force the abdominal viscera upward against the diaphragm, and that'll accelerate its return to that domed position. So those muscles will also help pull the rib cage down and inward. Anyway, so these changes then to these pressures that accompany that forced breathing will also help return that venous blood back to the heart. So this is going to help blood flow too, right? Working together. Remember, these two systems are coming together to assist and increase the blood flow. So you got all your muscles working here to help with that. So these, as that intra-abdominal and intrathoracic pressure increases, it's going to be transmitted to the great veins, the pulmonary veins, the superior and inferior vena cava, and that basically is taking that blood back to the heart. And when the pressure decreases, the veins return to their original size and they're able to fill with blood. So the changes within the abdomen and the thorax are going to squeeze that blood in the veins, and that's going to help assist the return, right? That's that milking action. So that's known as the respiratory pump, and that's essential to help maintain that adequate venous return. All right, so I talked too long again and didn't move my slide forward. So there's the slide that indicates the respiratory pump and the milking action to help assist in that return of that blood. All right, so let's move on to respiratory volumes. And there's a nice picture here to show you the basic volumes of the lungs and how they can be measured through a spirometer. And so that's what you see this gentleman holding. This is a pretty basic spirometer. The spirometer measures the volumes of air that is inspired and expired. And so we're looking at different volumes of air that are going into and out of the lungs. All right, so a simple spirometer would generally be attached to a bell. The bell would be filled with air, and it's partially submerged in water. And that tube is going to run from the subject's mouth under the water and emerge inside the bell. And that'll be just above the water level. But as the person exhales, that air flows down that tube and into the bell, causing the bell to rise. The bell is attached to a pen, and that pen is going to be moving based on the airflow and the rotating drum. So this is used to measure lung volumes, capacities, even flow rates, and these are used to diagnose different respiratory disorders. Now, when we look at the amount of air that just moves in and out of your lungs with every breath you take, that's called tidal volume, okay? So that's this one right here, just sitting and resting and letting the air go into and out of your lungs. That's called tidal volume. Another one you see here is vital capacity. The vital capacity is the greatest amount of air that can be expired after maximal inspiration. So you might take a deep breath and just expire maximally, okay? But notice that even after you expire maximally, there's still some air left in your lungs. So the amount of air that remains in the lungs after the maximal inspiration is called residual volume. So that's this right here. This is residual volume. That residual volume plus that vital capacity is the total lung capacity. And then the only other one here to point out is number 4 here. This is that functional residual capacity. And that is the volume of air remaining in the lungs after a normal expiration. All right, let's move on to the next slide. All right, so gas exchange is going to occur by diffusion. That's going to occur between the alveoli and the capillaries, and that's called pulmonary diffusion. So that's the movement of those gases. And the goal here is to replenish the oxygen that is getting used up at the tissue level. So that's the whole underlying goal here. And it's going to, of course, remove the carbon dioxide from the venous blood. That's that waste product from the systemic tissue. So air is going to be brought into the lungs during pulmonary ventilation, breathing, right, enabling the gas exchange to occur through pulmonary diffusion. Now, oxygen from the air is actually going to diffuse from the alveoli into the blood. And that's going to be done to those pulmonary capillaries that I showed you that are wrapped around those alveoli. And of course, the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse from the capillaries and into the alveoli so that they can be exhaled. And the alveoli are those little tiny little grape-like clusters at the end of those terminal bronchioles. Now, blood from the body returns through the vena cava to the right side of the heart. If you remember, from the right ventricle, this blood is pumped through the pulmonary artery, and it's going to go to each of the lungs, and it's going to work its way down through those pulmonary capillaries. And it's those capillaries that form that intricate network around those alveolar sacs. And they're really, really small, and they're going to allow those red blood cells to basically come through in single file, and those oxygen molecules are going to be coming from inside the alveoli to inside the blood vessels, those capillaries, and the carbon dioxide is going to move in the opposite direction from the inside of those capillaries to the inside of the alveoli. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. All right, so let's look at blood flow. So this is a nice overview picture of, here's our lungs, right? Here's our trachea, we've got our bronchial trees here. We know that that deoxygenated blood is coming in to the right atrium. It's going to go to the right ventricle. Right ventricles are going to contract, push it out the pulmonary trunk. It's going to go out through either pulmonary artery and to each left and right lung. That oxygenated blood is going to return to the heart, to the left ventricle, and it's going to be moved out of the heart through the left ventricle. It's going to go out the aorta, and the aorta is basically going to ensure that that oxygenated blood gets delivered throughout the body. Okay, all right, so that all said, the lungs are going to receive about 4 to 6 liters per minute of blood flow. Of course, that's going to vary with body size, but just note that the cardiac output from the right side of the heart approximately is going to be the same as the cardiac output from the left side of the heart. So the blood flow is going to be the same, however, the pressures and the vascular resistance in the blood vessels and the lungs are much different, and they're actually quite low. So the range in pressure difference on the pulmonary side is actually between 15 and 5, whereas compared to the mean arterial pressure on the left side is actually 95 millimeters of mercury and potentially higher. Of course, that's systolic pressure, right? But this is mean arterial pressure is 95, so mean arterial pressure is what we're looking at here. So the bottom line is there's a very low pressure gradient or pressure differential on the venous or the pulmonary side, I should say, whereas it's much higher on the systemic side. And also the resistance is going to be much lower because these are thinner walled vessels, so it's going to be easier for blood to flow through. And this is, of course, due to the, there's much less smooth muscle tissue in these thinner walled vessels. All right, so let's move on to the respiratory membrane where we can actually start to talk about what's happening at this level. So now we're looking at here our terminal bronchioles. They're going to end up in these clusters of alveoli. These clusters of alveoli are actually wrapped in capillaries. Okay, so we zoom in on this and we can see here's a single alveoli. It's called alveolus. And so we can actually zoom in on a little part here. So these alveoli, remember, they're all wrapped around in these intricate capillary networks, right? And so if I zoom in on a section here and I look at the wall, I shouldn't say the wall, but for lack of a better word, I'm going to take the wall here and zoom in and look at it. And so what we do is we call this section here the respiratory membrane. And it's the respiratory membrane because that's where the gas exchange has to occur. And so what's happening, if this is my alveoli, I've breathed in some oxygen, and that oxygen is going to diffuse from high to low concentration into my capillaries where the red blood cells are. And the CO2 that's been in here, that's being brought away from the tissues, is going to diffuse from high to low concentration so that it can be exhaled out. Okay, so we call this the respiratory membrane because that's what the oxygen and the CO2 have to get through, right? So when we factor in this alveolar capillary membrane, we're taking into account the alveolar plasma membrane. We're taking into account the capillary membrane or the capillary wall. And then we have what are called here basement membranes. And so this basement membrane is just the outer connective tissue that's around the plasma membrane here, and it's around the cells that form the capillaries. So that's what has to get through. So the surface area which these gases are exchanged is large. It's a large surface area, 300 million alveoli. It's quite huge, and these are very thin respiratory membranes, and they really will enhance gas exchange. And so the only thing that would cause, problems would be this space in here between the alveoli and, of course, the capillary itself. If this space, if something got in this space, or if something caused this distance to become wider, that would delay the gas exchange, or potentially something could build up inside the alveoli, right? You could get a blocked alveoli, then there could be no gas exchange right here. And maybe there's excessive mucus here, right? If that would be a problem, that would limit gas exchange. So those are all important factors. All right, so let's look at the partial pressures of gases. All right, so now we're going to get into some more, fun numbers. The air we breathe is just not 100% oxygen, which you probably realized already. Each gas has its own pressure, its own proportion to its concentration of the mixture of gases, and so the individual pressure from each of the gases is called its partial pressure. So nitrogen has its own partial pressure, oxygen has its own partial pressure, CO2 has its own partial pressure. And we add them all up, we get a total mixture or total pressure of all the mixture of gases, and that's Dalton's law. So it's the sum of all the pressures of the individual gases, and that's what we have here. So all the mixture of gases, we're going to, stick with these numbers here. There's a few things that would be in here if we wanted to get nitpicky, but overall, most of it is nitrogen, so 79%, 21% for oxygen, and 0.03% for carbon dioxide. So when we consider the air we breathe, it's mostly nitrogen, and then the rest is oxygen and CO2, and we just want to mention those because they're the dominant ones and the ones that we're really, mostly interested in here for the respiratory system. Now, the percentages here remain pretty constant at most altitudes. At sea level, the atmospheric pressure is approximately 760 millimeters of mercury. We call that the standard atmospheric pressure. It's going to be abbreviated ATM in some of the things that you're going to be looking at. So if the total atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury, then if we know what the percents are, we can figure out the partial pressure of nitrogen is around 600.7 because it's 79% of the total of 760 millimeters of mercury. Now oxygen we know is 21%, so its partial pressure would be 159.1 millimeters of mercury. And then carbon dioxide's partial pressure is about 0.2 millimeters of mercury because it's 0.03% of the 760 millimeters of mercury. So now we can tell the partial pressures of the total gases in the atmosphere. Okay, so in our body, these gases are actually dissolved in our fluids, right? So they're dissolved in the blood plasma. And Henry's law says that the gases dissolve in liquids in proportion to their partial pressures. That's going to depend upon their solubility, which we're going to realize is important in certain fluids and at temperatures. So a gas's solubility in blood is a constant, so it's always going to stay the same. So the most important critical factor here that we're really focused on is the gas exchange between the alveoli and the blood is dependent upon the pressure gradient between the gases in those two areas. So if we look at gas exchange in the alveoli, those differences in the partial pressure of the gases in those alveoli and the gases in the blood create a partial pressure, they actually create pressure gradients. Where are those pressure gradients? They're across the respiratory membranes. So that's the foundational basis of the gas exchange during pulmonary diffusion. So if the pressures on each side of the membrane were equal, then the gases would be at equilibrium and there wouldn't be any movement. Okay, but that really never happens. The pressures are not equal, so gases are always moving according to their partial pressure gradients from a high partial pressure gradient to a low partial pressure gradient. All right, so I think I did it again. I went through this slide. Yes. Okay, so we're done with that, and wow, we were just cruising. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is oxygen exchange. All right, so the partial pressure of oxygen of air outside your body, remember this is at standard atmospheric pressure, we already said is 159 millimeters of mercury. Now, when we move that into the body, into the alveoli, that is 105 millimeters of mercury. So as air is inhaled and it enters into the alveoli, it gets moistened and it mixes with the air in the alveoli. So the alveolar air gets saturated with water vapor. It has a partial pressure and it contains more carbon dioxide than in the inspired air. So because there's increased water vapor pressure and there's increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide, that contributes to the total pressure, to the total pressures in the alveoli. All right, so because there's a constant fresh air that's ventilating the lungs and it's constantly mixing with the air in the alveoli, while some of the other alveoli gases are exhaled to the environment. Because that's pretty much constant, the alveolar gas concentrations are pretty much going to be stable. All right, so we've pretty much got a good understanding, I hope, of the partial pressure of oxygen inside the alveoli of being 105 and why that's 105. Now let's look at the blood. Okay, so here's the blood. So here's our capillaries right here. Now the blood is constantly moving, right? It's constantly moving, going from it's making its way around its circuit from the pulmonary circuit to the systemic circuit. And so what happens is the blood is going to basically move the oxygen based on the metabolic needs of the tissues. And so it's going to end up entering the pulmonary capillaries with a partial pressure of oxygen of about 40 millimeters of mercury. And that's indicated right here. Okay, so as the blood is basically coming from the right side of the heart, right? That's deoxygenated blood going out the pulmonary trunk, going to the pulmonary arteries, circulating into these capillaries around the alveoli with the goal of picking up oxygen and getting rid of CO2. Well, by this point, the partial pressure of oxygen is 40 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so that's 65 millimeters of mercury less than the partial pressure of oxygen inside the alveoli. So that 65 is the pressure gradient for oxygen across the respiratory membrane that we just talked about. So that pressure gradient is going to drive oxygen from its high partial pressure concentration gradient to the low partial pressure gradient. So basically the oxygen is going to start moving into the capillaries. It's going to move from its high partial pressure gradient to a low partial pressure gradient. All right, the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli is always going to pretty much stay constant. It's always going to be about 105 millimeters of mercury. So as that deoxygenated blood is coming in to the pulmonary artery, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is about 40 millimeters of mercury, but that blood is going to be constantly moving by those capillaries, and that's going to allow continuous gas exchange to occur, so that by the time that pulmonary blood is going to reach the venous end of the capillaries, the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is going to equal that of what was in the alveoli. And so basically, the point is, you see it's coming in with a partial pressure of 40 millimeters of mercury. By the time those capillaries work their way around, all around the lungs and grab the oxygen, the partial pressure of oxygen is at about 105 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so now at this point we would say that the blood is saturated with oxygen to its full carrying capacity. Now the blood leaving the lungs is going to go through those pulmonary veins and return to the systemic side of the heart. Remember the left atrium, it's going to go to the left ventricle, and then that's going to be pumped to the rest of the body. Okay, so that's basically what is being illustrated here. Going to the body now. In this case, it's showing you a skeletal muscle cell. Now, notice, what did I want to point out? Partial pressures. Notice the partial pressure in the pulmonary vein is at for oxygen is at 100 millimeters of mercury. It's not at 105, okay? So this was at 105, this is at 100, this is at 100, okay? The difference here is pretty small, but it basically, the reason for that is there are local needs of oxygen during transport that have to occur. And so that's why it drops from 105 to 100, and that's why it doesn't, stay there. All right, so let's just talk a little bit about diffusion through the tissues. And I want to mention Phys law, and that's on the next slide. And so Phys law is a law that states that the rate of diffusion is proportional to the surface area and the partial pressure gradient. So here's my surface area, right? Because this is my respiratory membrane, all right? So this is my alveoli. This is my capillary with my red blood cell. So it's going to be proportional to surface area and partial pressure gradients, all right? So that's going to determine my rate of diffusion. So the greater the partial pressure gradient for oxygen across that respiratory membrane, the more rapidly oxygen is going to diffuse across it. That rate of diffusion is also going to be inversely proportional to the thickness of the tissue. So the thicker the tissue, the slower the diffusion. Then there's also a diffusion constant, and that is unique to gas that's going to influence the rate of diffusion across the tissue. Now, carbon dioxide has a much lower diffusion constant than oxygen, and as a result, even though there's not a great difference between alveolar and capillary partial pressures of carbon dioxide, as there is for oxygen, carbon dioxide still diffuses easily. Okay, so that's just the nature of the molecules. The rate at which the oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into the blood is called the oxygen diffusion capacity, and that is expressed as the volume of oxygen that diffuses through the membrane each minute for a pressure difference of 1 millimeters of mercury. All right, so this partial pressure gradient between the venous blood that's coming into the lung and the alveolar air is about 65 millimeters of mercury. Remember, our differential here is 105 millimeters of mercury versus 40. So that oxygen diffusion capacity gets calculated on the basis of the mean pressure in the pulmonary capillary. That's going to be substantially higher for the partial pressure of oxygen. So that gradient between the mean partial pressure of the pulmonary capillary and the alveolar air is about 11 millimeters of mercury. That's going to provide a diffusion of about 231 milliliters of oxygen per minute through the respiratory membrane. Now, if you get to maximal exercise, then that oxygen diffusion capacity is going to have to increase up to 3 times the resting rate because the blood is returning to the lungs very low on oxygen, right? And there's going to be a greater partial pressure gradient from the alveoli to the blood. That's going to have to be addressed, and they find that with trained athletes even. The increase in oxygen diffusion capacity from rest to exercise is caused by a relatively inefficient, sluggish circulation through the lungs at rest, which results primarily from limited perfusion of the upper regions of the lungs, and that's attributed to gravity. So remember I told you about how the lungs actually go up, kind of up into underneath your clavicle is where they are. So if the lung is divided into 3 zones, and that's indicated on this slide. So on this slide, you can see the lungs are divided into 3 zones. At rest, only the bottom third, that zone 3 of the lung, is perfused with blood. And during exercise, blood flow through the lungs is going to be greater, and it's going to be due to the elevated blood pressure. That's going to increase your lung perfusion. Okay, so bottom line is, when you're at rest, your oxygen diffusion capacity is limited because you have incomplete lung perfusion. All right, so the bottom third here, roughly, is perfused. The top third has poor gas exchange. Okay, that's just due to gravity. During exercise, that diffusion capacity is going to increase because more of your lung tissue is getting perfused. There's more exchange, essentially, over that lung surface area. You've increased the surface area for exchange. All right, so I feel like I missed a few things. Let me go back to this and see if I hit anything or missed anything that I needed to hit. Okay, so I looking through here, it looks like I have addressed these diffusion constant differences, and I addressed the diffusion capacity here, the resting diffusion capacity, and then what happens with maximal exercise oxygen diffusion capacity. So let's look at carbon dioxide briefly, and I'm going to refer you to one of the pictures in the text. So carbon dioxide also moves along its partial pressure gradient. And if you refer back to figure 7.6, that blood passing from the right side of the heart through the alveoli has a partial pressure for CO2 of about 46 millimeters of mercury. Some books are going to say 45. Air inside the alveoli has a partial pressure for CO2 of about 40. So it's only 5-6 millimeters of mercury, but it's enough. It's a small pressure gradient, but it's more than enough to allow for the exchange, the movement of the CO2 away from the capillaries and into the alveoli for the person to exhale. So I'm going to move back to the slide here and just show you that with my pointer. And so here's what they're talking about. So this partial pressure of CO2 inside the alveoli is only 40. Partial pressure of CO2 is 46 in the capillaries. So this is that, deoxygenated blood that just arrived in the lung, and it's loaded with CO2. Well, so I've got a gradient here, 46 to 40, and so this CO2 is going to move from my capillaries into the alveoli so that can be exhaled. And then by the time I work my way across my capillary bed, that partial pressure of CO2 will have dropped down to 40, same as it is in the alveoli. All right, so a couple of other things to note. All right, so I'm just going to point out to you this table. This table shows you the partial pressures of the gases. Notice that the total pressure in the venous blood is only 706. So that's this right here. So you're seeing all of these, dry air, alveolar air, arterial blood. And then look what happens with venous blood. So venous blood has 706 millimeters of mercury. That's 54 millimeters of mercury than the total pressure in the dry air and the alveolar air. So that's basically due to a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen. So look at the partial pressure of oxygen. So there's a dramatic decrease in partial pressure of oxygen with that increase in the partial pressure of CO2. So as the blood goes through the body's tissues. So you see a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen and an increase in the partial pressure of CO2. And then if we look at figure 7.9, in figure 7.9 here you see this oxygen cascade. So it shows these dropping partial pressures of oxygen at sea level from dry ambient air to the tissues and into the venous circulation, draining those tissues. So this is called the oxygen cascade. At sea level, our barometric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. That partial pressure of oxygen in ambient air would be 159 millimeters of mercury, and that's what's shown here in this oxygen cascade. As that dry air moves through the nose and the mouth, it becomes humidified. water is basically added, and air in the trachea has a partial pressure of 149 millimeters of mercury. Then in the alveoli, the air is becoming mixed with a combination of CO2. The partial pressure of CO2 is now present because of that blood that has been returning that CO2 from the tissues that have been metabolically active, and the partial pressure of oxygen from the tracheal air, and that's going to equilibrate at approximately 105 millimeters of mercury. As the oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into those pulmonary capillaries and into the arterial blood, that partial pressure of oxygen is going to continue to drop slightly down its diffusion gradients, since those pulmonary capillaries with the blood is going to be a mixture of arterial and venous blood. That's a so-called admixture. Okay, so that's what's happening here and here. Now at the tissue level, okay, so now we're going to get to the tissue level right here. Cells are going to be using up and pulling out that oxygen from the arterial supply for aerobic metabolism. And so the drop in that partial pressure of oxygen from the arterial blood to the venous blood that's flowing away from the tissues is going to represent the arterial venous oxygen. So this is arterial venous oxygen difference, or AV difference, AV oxygen difference, and that partial pressure of oxygen at the mitochondrial level is deeply low, approximately 1.2 millimeters of mercury. So that's going to ensure optimal oxygen delivery to those organelles, which is the ultimate destination, right, of the oxygen when it gets used for oxidative phosphorylation.